When the United States was openly mulling the prospect of going to war with Iraq, people inside Iraq who were enemies of Saddam, people who wanted the U.S. to invade Iraq and overthrow him, found that the U.S. government and, in some cases, the U.S. press were very interested in hearing all the horrible things they had to say about Saddam. Now, Saddam was a horrible guy, so it wasn't hard to find horrible things to say about him. But the known record of his awful behavior toward his own people had previously not been enough to get the U.S. to invade Iraq. But once the Bush administration got bent on war, once it seemed like the U.S. was being led to war, and it just needed to be tipped a little bit further, all sorts of new horrible things about Saddam Hussein that hadn't been known before started to pop up in the press. A CIA report that Saddam had imported aluminum tubes that could be used in centrifuges to enrich uranium to make nuclear weapons. That exciting little piece of data, which proved to be out of context and not true, that's not what the tubes were for, that nevertheless ended up on the front page of the New York Times. It had been leaked to the New York Times by people inside the Bush administration who had access to raw bits of out-of-context intel like that. Recognizing that that sort of thing sounded really scary, they plucked it out of context, didn't check it for accuracy, leaked it to the New York Times, and then cited the fact that it had been in the New York Times as evidence that this scary claim was out there and should be added to the case for going to war.
Specifically aluminum tubes. There's a story in the New York Times this morning. This is, and I want to attribute to the Times. I don't want to talk about, obviously, specific intelligence sources, but it's now public that, in fact, he has been seeking to acquire, and we have been able to intercept and prevent him from acquiring through this particular channel, the kinds of tubes that are necessary to build a centrifuge.
Yeah, that was bullpucky. Leaked for the purpose of trying to get the U.S. to invade Iraq. But that leak to the New York Times and then citing the New York Times as having published it, that was very effective at the time. Part of the Colin Powell presentation to the UN around that same time about why the U.S. was going to invade Iraq was what he described as evidence of Iraq's mobile biological weapons labs. That intel, which was publicized to try to get us to war with Iraq, came from an Iraqi defector nicknamed Curveball, a guy who later admitted that he made up everything he told to German intelligence, specifically to try to get the West to go to war with Iraq because he thought Saddam was an enemy. The complicity and direct help of our own government in selling us that bullpucky, that was not true, in order to make it politically possible to go to war in Iraq, that is the original sin of the George W. Bush era in America. But it does not mean that they cooked up all that fake and misleading intelligence all by themselves. Some of it came from enemies of Saddam and Iraqi exiles and expats and activists who shoveled it to the U.S., knowing it was false, but hoping that we would nevertheless fall for it because they wanted us to invade. That recent history of the U.S. and how we get into wars these days looms large, right? It looms large particularly on days like this, when we see bombshell headlines like this one. Our friend Josh Rogan at Foreign Policy Tonight reporting that someone inside the Obama administration says that he or she has seen a cable that, if the information in that cable is true, would be a very scary thing. The headline, as you can see there, chemical weapons used in Syria. The chemical weapons used, I mean, nobody's known to have used chemical weapons in 25 years. We know Syria has them, but have they used them in their civil war? Because that really would change everything. But look back at that headline again. The part before the part that would change everything is crucial. Secret State Department cable says chemical weapons used in Syria. And can we see this secret State Department cable that says this incredibly inflammatory thing? No, of course not. It's secret. And it is an unnamed Obama administration official who says that he or she has seen this secret cable and that it makes a, quote, compelling case that this Rubicon has been crossed in Syria. The same official then quoted multiple times insisting that the U.S. must react, that Syria is testing our resolve, that when the president said any use of chemical weapons would be a red line, well, then this incident means he must really not have meant it. It is, of course, possible that it is true that Syria has used chemical weapons. If it is true, it is both awful on its face, and it is something that the President and the Secretary of State said would be treated as a red line, would earn a serious response from the United States. In his report tonight, Josh notes that it is activists and defectors from Syria who are marketing this story, that Syria has crossed that red line. This reported secret document from U.S. State Department officials in Turkey, Josh says, was also born of interviews with Syrian activists and defectors, who, of course, very much want the largest military power on earth involved on their side of their war with their own government. The whole thing is both very worrying and almost sort of emotionally triggering for us as a country still traumatized by the last time people inside our own government stovepiped specific scary intelligence to the media in order to scare us into a war we wouldn't have otherwise been involved in. Oh, and also, incidentally, our ally France just invaded Mali, and we're helping in some ways. Times like this, we sort of need expert assistance to try to sort out what is going on in the world and what we know about it. Joining us now is NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel. Richard, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Bullpucky?
Bullpucky is
twice.
It's a term of art.
I was looking, actually, because from this angle, I can see your teleprompter, and you actually wrote Bullpucky.
Yes, I wrote this script and I wrote Bullpucky.
I wasn't sure that was a real word,
yeah.
but on a much more serious
note. What do you make of this report from Josh? It's very scary, and also, for me, reminds me of a lot of stuff I've heard before.
I'd heard this report from Syrian rebels while I was inside Syria, because at the time I was asking them, did they think that the regime would use chemical weapons? They said, well, of course the regime already has used chemical weapons, and they referred to an incident specifically in Homs in December, around Christmas time, December 23rd. Okay. And I was listening to activists tell me about it, and it seemed not convincing, frankly. They said that there had been some gas released in Homs, potentially fired from tanks, maybe dropped from the air, and that it made people sick. I asked if anyone was killed. They said no. I said, well, maybe this is tear gas. Maybe there was something else that got people sick. When buildings are dropping, there's asbestos in the air, there's dust in the air. There's a lot of things that seem suspicious. And I've heard you hear claims like this all the time. When I was in Gaza, for example, and I've been there twice for wars, you hear Gazans talk about the Israelis firing chemical weapons on them. And I think they usually mean white phosphorus, which is a different kind of weapon. So I generally treat these claims with a great deal of suspicion. And in this case, I couldn't find any compelling evidence and didn't report it. Now we see this claim coming out in a leaked cable. So what's new is the leaked cable, and what's new is that the United States is investigating it. Good. And it deserves to be investigated. It's an inflammatory claim. And that this leaked cable, that this cable has been leaked to the media. What they're talking about specifically, according to experts who were listening to this testimony, and they were listening to some of the symptoms, because this gas wouldn't necessarily be lethal unto itself. It was causing nausea, it was causing hallucinations. It sounds like something called BZ gas. And BZ gas is not sarin or tabin. It is not a nerve agent. It is not even in the same kind of scale. This is not a red line kind of event. This is not a genocide weapon.
The type of symptoms being described would indicate it's that kind of weapon, which is a chemical weapon, but not the worst kind of chemical weapon.
Not even close to the worst kind of weapon.
Okay.
The worst kind that Syria may or may not have, we pretty much know that they have sarin and tabin. Those are nerve agents. They will kill you. If they're dropped on a village, they'll cause mass casualties and then dissipate. VX, also nerve agent, also lethal. What's even worse about that is if it's dropped on a village, it kills people and then stays there.
Persists.
It persists, so people can't go in. This is a gas that makes people unconscious, disoriented, vomit, and according to opposition medical sources, the people who died, allegedly 5, choked because they vomited and choked on the vomit. So it would be a different kind of scale if indeed it happened.
And we need to watch for further reports, including from the State Department, whether they confirm what's in this cable or how they've assessed it. On another matter, on Mali, France has invaded Mali. They're upscaling.
The socialist government, unilateral military action. Who would have thought that?
Well, is the U.S. going to get involved?
There will not be American boots on the ground. I can't imagine that. But the U.S. is involved. There are now about 900 French troops on the ground. Armored vehicles, 40 or so of them, and the U.S. is providing logistical assistance and more, intelligence, satellite images, aerial refueling, lift, which meaning airport air transfer of some equipment. So the U.S. is very pleased that France is doing this. I think to a degree surprised. Even just about 2 weeks ago, France said it wouldn't do this. And now France is going to have eventually about 2,500 troops on the ground and be involved in ground combat in Mali. And there's some specific reasons France is doing this. France saw that extremists in the north, some of them linked to al-Qaeda, were marching toward the capital, Bamako. They were heading south. And the government in Bamako panicked, called France for assistance, and France intervened. France also was worried that there's a very large community of people from Mali, about 200,000, living in Paris, living in France. And France was worried that these Malian nationals would be influenced by the extremists back home and carry out attacks. And France had intelligence that an attack may have been even in the active planning stages.
France's reaction to what happened in Mali and the U.S. reaction to what France did is fascinating at the outset. It's going to be more fascinating when we see the extent of how much the U.S. decides to be in support. Will you come back and talk to us about it more with a big map?
Bring the map.
We will.
Bring the map. And will you say bullpucky?
I will say bullpucky, but never accusingly at you. Richard Engel.
Maybe. Well, it depends on what I say.
I guess that's true. Richard Engel, of course, NBC's chief foreign correspondent. All right, we'll be right back.